Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly chat about local history. Thanks again for joining me. Thanks for supporting this project. Hear a lot of feedback, and that's wonderful. I'm Rob Goller. I'm the Town and Village Historian, and again, as I say each week, this project, these videos, a lot of my research are separate from my official duties as Town and Village Historian. This week's topic comes from a news report that I had come across on TV about how expensive cars have become, and not only just the cars, but the insurance to cover the cars. A lot of us are seeing our insurance rates go up a lot. Um, and one of the reasons is all these bells and whistles that are now on these cars, where if you have a car accident, uh, sensors that weren't on cars before that need to be replaced. Say a bumper gets hit, it's not just the bumper that needs to be replaced or fixed, it's all the sensors that come with it. There's just a lot more expense to it, and a lot of the safety features and other features that we've grown accustomed to in our cars cost money. So the cost of cars are going up along with supply chain issues and all the other things, the computer components that they were saying in this report of how expensive cars were. And I got to cars are today, and I got to thinking about how the idea of an automobile ownership has evolved over time. And there's this, well, first I was thinking about that report about how there was a great episode of The Wonder Years, if you remember that show, where one of the neighbors gets a brand new car and all the neighbors come out to see it. And that was back in the day, 1970s, where getting a new car was a very big deal. A lot of people uh, in the world at the time had only one car per household, if that. And so today we have a lot more cars, and I think we don't have this excitement over a brand new car. Maybe we ourselves do when we get one, of course. But it's not like the whole neighborhood comes out to watch the car come down the street. Certainly, our friends and neighbors might be excited, but it doesn't, I don't think, generate as much excitement because we're all most of us have cars, not everybody, and there are just a lot more cars. There are a lot more cars per household than there were even back in the 1970s. So I got to thinking about that, but I also got to thinking about this great photograph from 1916 that shows the parade of cars that occurred here in East Aurora. And what would happen back then? Now remember, this is 1916. Cars were just starting to come out, and the dealerships in town, there were a couple of them, and a lot of people, either some smart business people, saw the trend happening with new automobiles and they got in on it. So they may have been in a different industry, and then they decided, oh, on the side, I'll diversify my portfolio and start selling cars. Um, and one of the dealers in town was Mr. Kelver, who, if you are familiar with Kelver Court, it's between Oakwood and Main Street, East Oakwood, a little road there. That's where his dealership was. He had started off in Wales Center, but that picture is from his dealership. And what happened is you didn't just go to a dealership and look around and look even you didn't look around at used cars and even brand new cars. They didn't have any like a group of cars that you could just buy right off the lot. You had to actually order all cars, and so their showroom would be one, two, three cars tops. And actually, Mr. Kelver, there's a great photo of his showroom, which is just a display window with one car in it. And you would go and look at the latest model, and you would might get to be able to test drive. You might be able to get to see one. Usually you did on the at the dealership, but it was the one car. And you'd have to order the car in December or January. And the this was the 1910s. So this great picture was in 1916. Um, and it showed all the cars lined up in the spring, and the people, they called it the parade of cars. You had to order your car in January, and it would arrive in April, around April. And you could still buy a car probably in March into April and May, but the dealerships were very clear in their advertising in the newspapers that if you did not order your car, you would be out of luck come springtime, because all the orders, they could only make so many cars. yes, there was mass production, but not at the scale that there is today. So you had to order your car way in advance, months in advance. Some people were waiting 6 months to a year. And so at around December, January, you would start seeing in advertisements in the newspaper of this is your last chance to buy a car. And so you'd have to place the order in the dead of winter, which was very difficult for people. That must have been a difficult thing, the mindset back then for the dealerships to get people to think about spring. Because what happens is what's happening now, and the reason I'm talking about this now, and part of the reason is the nice weather's coming, and this is the time of year that these new cars would arrive. This is when we start thinking, oh, I want to drive places, I want to get out. Not in the middle of January. And especially back then, it's hard for us to fathom today, but people did not drive cars in the middle of winter back in the 1910s. First, the roads weren't treated like they are today, so they weren't plowed. A lot of country roads weren't plowed like they are today, so you couldn't really necessarily drive a car, nor would you want to. And so a lot of people who had a car would put it away, would store their car. And again, there were a lot of advertisements in the paper to allow for that. Later on in the 1920s, they started having cars that you could drive around in the winter, and the roads were becoming paved, um, and they would actually sell car coats that you would wear because there was no roof on a lot of these cars, or heat. Heat didn't come along for a long time. So, um, but in the 1910s, you would not drive the car, so people wouldn't be in the mood to buy a car in the dead of winter. So the dealerships had to do a great deal of promotion and advertising to get people to start thinking about buying a car over the winter. Then April came, and all the cars that were ordered were delivered to the local dealerships. What would happen is people would go pick up their car, and Mr. Kelver was one of the dealers who would do it on one day and arrange for a photographer to come to take a picture of all these folks driving their car off the quote unquote lot, actually the street in front of the dealership. And a lot of people would come out to see this. They would see the new cars come because this was a big deal. There weren't many cars. There weren't many people who could afford cars, and I'll talk about that in a second. So to see this scene would have been surreal. Frankly, this would be a time when cars and horse-drawn carriages and wagons were mixing on the streets, which caused other problems that we could talk about another day. Uh, but that would had been a sight for people to see is these cars pulling out of the lot, and the owners of these cars, maybe they were a little humble, and but I think they secretly enjoyed being watched and watching them drive the car. It was sort of um, a status symbol that you could own a car. And so being watched as you drive off, and people uh, jealous of your car as you're driving off. So this parade would happen of the cars leaving the dealership, and people would be attracted to it. It would draw a crowd, and the newspapers actually talked about the crowds that were drawn by the new cars that were driving around. And there were not that many cars that would be driving around in the spring. So it would be a big deal of who had a car. Mr. Smith and Mrs. Smith got a new car. That there was an elite group essentially that could afford a new car, and during this time period, and so people would know that and would be talking about it. It would be create a buzz in the community. So the dealership did this. They had a parade of cars, and the dealership enjoyed this just as much as the people buying the car, because in Mr. Kelver's case, he took a picture of all the people leaving, and he used it in promotions, in sales in the newspaper. So he would place a picture in the paper and try to create some jealousy of this could be you. This could be you leaving my dealership with a new car. Look at all your friends. Look at your neighbors leaving the dealership with the new car. And so I think this created, it's hard to imagine today. People get new cars all the time, trade in their leases. It's becoming harder today, as the news report I talked about, which has got me thinking about the history of this. But it would have been a much bigger deal for people to see the cars, the brand new cars leaving the dealership. And this was a big deal because today a lot more people own cars. I was shocked to find out, um, and and to put it in perspective, um, one out of I had done research about this years ago. I wrote an article about it, and so I've revisited it recently. Only one out of every 30 people in Erie County had registered a car back in 1916, the year of this photograph that I was talking about. And the rate for New York State as a whole was one out of every 41 residents. So one out of every 30 people in Erie County is not a lot of people who could own a car back then. Now, by comparison, more recently, census figures indicate that nearly 7 out of every 10 people own a car today in suburban areas of Erie County. So a lot more people own cars, and there are a lot more cars per household today. So that the idea of a car as a status symbol is a lot less. It's a lot less of a status symbol as it was back in the 1910s when cars first came out. A car back then um, costs between 500 for a really small one to 1,900 and so about $2,000 for a car back then. Well, that doesn't seem like a lot, but when you translate that into modern dollars, that's over, that's like 15,000 to almost $50,000 for a car. Now, a lot of that was the report the other day talking about the price of cars going up. That's around what they cost today. But people, the way transportation works, we need cars. If you're not in an area that has public transportation, you need a car. So back then, you didn't necessarily need a car either. There was the train to get you to the city, there were passenger trains. Um, and so it wasn't essential to have an automobile back then. There were also stores on every corner here in the village of East Aurora and in other communities as well. There were a lot more grocery stores. The plan of a village of commerce was done so for people to walk to. Um, so you could walk to it. There would be several stores of the same store. A grocer would open up a grocery store on both ends of the village so people could walk there. Today, that doesn't happen. You really need a car, and so it's more of an essential thing. It's not a luxury. So the idea of of the car as a status symbol has changed. Now the style of car, there's certainly a status symbol to that today, but the idea of owning a car is different. And so you could get what they called it. There's a Cadillac back then. You could get that at S.H. Peak and Sons. Now they were in the lumber business. The Peak family here in East Aurora, and then they ventured out into cars because they were one of those folks that saw the potential for cars to be big business, and it was true. So we don't we have more cars on the road today, and so that's changed how we look at them. And I just find that fascinating throughout history how the car as a symbol of status has changed quite a bit, especially in small towns like ours. So what was a big deal back in the 1910s with this spring parade of cars down the street and people lining up to see a new car? I don't think that would happen today. Yeah, people get excited, but also we about cars, but not to that point. The thing that's also different is, and people do still order new cars, right? You can order a car and they'll custom make it and you can have it delivered. Um, but this happened each spring. And of course, there were cars available year round, not necessarily in the winter, but the spring delivery was a big deal because people had put their orders in over the winter months and then they could finally drive them in the spring. Um, so for all these cars to be purchased at the same time and to be delivered at the dealership at the same time, once the weather broke in the spring, that was a pretty big deal and created this image and this excitement that I don't think we see today. You can get a car any time of the year pretty much. There are better times to buy one than others if you read, but um, this idea that everybody's gathered to wait for that delivery of cars in the spring, we just don't have that anymore. So that has changed. What hasn't changed is I think um, the prices go up and down, And so today we may be seeing people not buying as many cars or waiting because of the prices of the cars going up, waiting for another purchase. So we might get back to the time where it's a little more exciting to get a new car. But they are much more from a standpoint of everybody being able to uh, have one. It's not. It's still not the case that everybody can afford a car today. So while a lot of things have changed, some things have not. And it also it may seem like just kind of interesting history, but there's also a change in how the car has changed how we look at transportation. So more people getting a car had a direct correlation to the fact that the number of passenger trains to Buffalo from East Aurora, and not just East Aurora, any community, you look at the history of the community, see when the passenger trains started to decline, when people could get cars. So people could, and then the Route 400 came along in the 1960s and 70s to replace Seneca Street. Well, more people had cars, and the train to Buffalo, the commuter train to Buffalo, wasn't seen as important. So the advent of the car and the evolution of the car impacted the train and how we looked at public transportation. And a lot in from the 1920s through through the highway systems after World War II, a lot of money and infrastructure money went toward the building of highways and improving that infrastructure, not public transportation. So we don't have train service like they do in other countries, and even other areas of our own country. We have they put the money into highways because people were using their cars and more people had cars. It's interesting to look back at the uh, uh, old newspaper articles and diaries and things when people talk about taking the train from Buffalo to East Aurora and East Aurora to Buffalo, or even Holland and points further, for social gatherings and meetings. They didn't have a car, and their life revolved around the timing of the train, of the commuter trains. And today, after the cars come along, you can just get in your car and hop on Route 400 anytime you want. 24 hours a day. You don't have to wait for the next train. So today the car is much more important for our transportation, but it's also less of a status symbol. It's more of a necessity than a status symbol like it was 100 years ago. So that change has happened over 100 years, and you'll see this in old movies too, where the rich people will talk about the car, and they have their own chauffeur because they don't know how to deal with a car, and they don't have a mechanic right around the corner. And it really wasn't. This was interesting because the 1910s, it would have been interesting to own a car because gas stations and service stations didn't really come around till the 1920s. You start seeing a lot more of them, and they were being built here in East Aurora. Um, and liveries were transforming into car dealerships, but it would have been harder to get your car repaired because there wasn't a service station on every corner. And so there was this period of time where cars were coming out and it was a luxury and it was a new thing. But you couldn't, the service of those vehicles hadn't caught up yet. And so it's interesting to see how by the 1920s we started seeing more of that. But really having a car um, in the 1910s was a luxury, but it also came with some downsides because there were so few of them that people didn't have, finding a gas station or a service station to handle them would have been much more difficult. Similar to it's kind of interesting how history repeats itself, the electric car today, where we are hearing that there's issues with that because there are so few of them relative to the whole pool of automobiles that they can't find places to charge because there's not enough. There are more cars coming along and not enough places to charge them. So that would have been a similar issue back in the 1910s when involving gasoline cars. There were also electric cars back then. We could talk about that another time. There were electric cars back in the early days, and they weren't necessarily seen as they were seen as lesser than the gasoline alternatives, which is interesting. But we can talk about that another time. So again, thank you for joining me. I hope that answers a couple questions about the history of vehicles in our communities. And of course, today everything seems to revolve around the automobile in many communities, and they're actually trying to revert back to making communities more pedestrian friendly when they're designing. And one of the biggest struggles is bringing the vehicles, bicycles, and pedestrians all together, which was a struggle throughout history. There were periods of time in the 20s and 30s where a lot more people were getting hit by cars and unfortunately dying from fatal accidents involving cars and pedestrians, because we didn't have crosswalks and things like that. There were a lot of safety things were not put in place. Stop signs were not a thing before these vehicles. So there was this period of time when cars were becoming more and more popular, but the traffic laws and the safety features of our sidewalks and our streets weren't catching up. It took a while for them to catch up. So you'll read a lot about that in the old days, um, around the 20s and 30s involving that. So again, thanks for joining me. Again, keep your comments coming. I appreciate all the feedback, and pop the comments either in the comment section or send me a message privately. Again, I'm Rob Goller. Thanks for joining me, and thank you for keeping history alive. We'll see you next time.